Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Marcus Cole. I'm the Dean of Notre Dame Law School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel of experts on how Catholic teaching animates human rights in Africa. We have a distinguished panel of guests, starting at my very far left with Dr. Robert Eno. Dr. Robert Eno is currently serving as a distinguished jurist in residence at Notre Dame Law School. He's from the Republic of Cameroon and is the registrar of the African Court of Human and People's Rights. Dr. Eno has had almost 3 decades of uninterrupted work experience in the human rights and related fields, working with NGOs, national human rights institutions, and academia and intergovernmental bodies. He has served as senior legal officer for the protection at the Secretariat of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights after serving as acting executive secretary of the African Commission. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Yaoundé in the Cameroon, a postgraduate diploma in human rights from the University of Zambia, a master's in law from the University of South Africa, and a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. To his right, to my left, but to his right is Father Paulinus Ikechukwu Odozor. He's a priest of the Congregation of the Holy Spirit and professor of moral theology and theology of the World Church and professor of Africana Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. He did his graduate studies at St. Michael's College in Toronto, Regis College in Toronto, and the University of Toronto. Father Odozor's scholarly interests include foundational issues in Christian ethics, history of Catholic moral theology, and African Christian theology. In addition to being the author of many articles and peer-reviewed publications, he has also authored or edited 9 books. Father Odozor has held numerous academic and administrative positions and was appointed by Pope Benedict XVI as expert assistant to the 2009 Synod of Bishops for Africa. To Father Odozor's right is Dr. Antoinette Kankindi. She's been a senior research fellow in the Integrity Program at Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya since 2013. At Strathmore Law School, she has run the Student Civic Initiative and the Youth and Women's Participation in Community Development and Public Life. She was the director of the Strathmore Governance Center from 2009 until 2013, and her field of expertise covers governance, political legitimacy, and historical and new interpretations of the Republican and liberal democratic traditions. Dr. Kankindi holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Navarra, Spain, an LLM and an LLB from the University of Kinshasa. She's worked as a legal officer on the legal advisory team for Chevron Overseas Company in Kinshasa and later at the Chilean Embassy for national and foreign policies. To her right is our own Professor Christine Venter. She's the director of the legal writing program at Notre Dame Law School, and she earned her BA degree from the University of Cape Town and her law degree from the University of Cape Town School of Law, where she was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. She also holds an LLM in International Law and Human Rights from the University of Notre Dame Law School and also a JSD from Notre Dame Law School. Before returning to Notre Dame, Professor Venter worked as an associate at a South African law firm specializing in civil rights litigation and then a U.S. firm specializing in international business law. She teaches legal writing as well as gender issues and international law. She also teaches international moot court and serves as the coach to the international moot court team here at Notre Dame. And finally, our moderator to my left is Professor Michael Otto. He's professor of law at Notre Dame Law School, where he serves as faculty director of the Notre Dame London Law Program. He's an international lawyer with expertise in international human rights law and the intersection of human rights and international business policy. Professor Addo holds a bachelor's degree with honors from the University of Ghana, a graduate diploma in legal practice from Ghana Law School, a Master of Laws degree, and a PhD in law from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, as well as a diploma in international human rights law from the International Institute of Human Rights at the University of Strasbourg in France. Professor Otto's expertise is recognized beyond the academy, including his appointment to the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, with a mandate to promote the implementation of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Otto.
Thank you very much, Dean Cole, for that very warm introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to join Dean Cole in welcoming you all to this important discussion on how the Catholic teaching animates human rights in Africa. In a moment, I want to go off to our panelists with a few prompts for them to reflect. The idea is that we have the room until 2 o'clock, so we'll keep going back and forth until about just before then, or for about an hour, and then we'll turn up to the audience for questions and answers, unless, of course, the panelists run out of steam sooner. I doubt that. Now, back to the subject, how does the Catholic Church animate human rights in Africa? Kind of thinking about a much more mundane question. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that we should ask this question? But I thought everybody would probably have a different thought of it, but I have this kind of reflected in statistics. Half of Africans are Christians. Think about it. 49.3% of Africans are Christians, of which 281 million are Catholics. That makes 20% of the entire Catholic population. And of all the other statistics that you can draw, 55 million are in one of the most war-torn countries there is, the DRC. Has the largest population of Catholics across that entire continent. That continent has 5,304 bishops. It has 415,656 priests. And it also has 670,320 nuns. So it does matter what the Catholic Church does in that continent. So I thought I'd put that in context. But before we do, I want to come to the panelists, and maybe in the order in which they are sat. There is always a very kind of political conversation that human rights are a Western concept. Of course, if that were the case, it would kind of guide where our conversation. So how true is it that human rights are a Western concept? Does the African system, African culture, not know human rights? Now, I want to come to Dr. Eno first, just for your thoughts on that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. I think the idea that human rights is a Western concept originated from the fact that when we look at the construction of human rights institutions, how it was born, even from within the UN, most of those who took part in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even in the establishment of the UN, in the drafting of major UN human rights instruments are from the West. Very few African countries were represented in most of these initiatives. I think at the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration, we had only South Africa, and I think 1 or 2 other African countries that participated. However, in my view, and this idea of human rights being a Western concept is gradually fading away, even in Africa. In my view, given the very nature of human rights, its universality, its indivisibility, and the fact that human beings anywhere and everywhere are created in God's image, human beings everywhere desire justice. Human beings everywhere need some form of dignity. I think it is generally being accepted now that human rights cuts across every human being, every society, whether you are African, whether you are European, whether you are Asian. So yes, that idea was there, and I think to some extent it was because Africans did not exactly take part in the development of all these instruments. But now with the openness, with the African countries getting independence, they begin to realize that the idea that human rights Western concept no longer holds true in the modern world.
Anybody who claims that human rights in Africa is a Western concept does not know the way Africans traditionally organize their villages, their societies, and the various levels at which life operates. From growing up in Nigeria, and reading a lot about Nigeria or West Africa or Africans, you find that there are always rights, there are always groups formed that exist for women, for men, for the whole groups that try to make sure that people are not trampled under. You might say, well, as I've argued, and let me put it out somewhere, to whom do these rights belong? How much, I argued somewhere, and people have taken me on that although these societies recognize that there are rights that are human, that belong to people at various categories, sometimes those rights are limited to the known other, to society, to the clan where I come from, to the group I belong to. One of the things, and this is where Professor No was talking about here, one of the things we weren't able to do was to find a way to make those rights a little more universal, to make them also rights that can be enforced or given to people who are not within my own known community or my own known world and so on. But those rights existed. Those rights existed, and people respected them often, but not always in a universal way.
Very much. Dr. Kankindi.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel and to see this great audience here. So I tend to look at the discourse on human rights and Africa from this whole idea of Africa, because when you are outside, you hear people speak about Africa as if it was a country, but it is a whole continent with a great diversity of communities. And then it's quite interesting that there's a variety of differences between the communities, and what is common to them is actually very similar to the system of human rights. What do I mean with that? We have, I'll use quick examples and a few things. You have principles like the principle of solidarity, which is a very rich one. Maybe it comes close to the one in the Catholic Church, but in Africa it's a very big principle. And together with the principle of solidarity, the principle of hospitality, that our houses were never closed, and even at some point in history you can see that they didn't have doors, yeah? because the dignity of the person coming to you is practically like more important than yours. Yeah? And that is something that is common to sub-Saharan Africa and above the Saharan Africa, and it's similar. Yeah. We had different type of institutions regarding human rights, and some people tell me that I'm too ambitious to call them that. because they are not inscribed in any written law. But for example, we never had institutions such as orphanages. Why? Because children who lost their parents are not familiar, are not lacking in family, because everyone had to take care of them. Everyone, practically. We didn't have institutions such as prisons, because our criminal system, which is about the restoration of violated rights, was enforced differently. That the whole community will deal with the criminal, and the criminal had to be restored in the community and not locked out. We could be kicked out of the community to go under the forest or whatever if you cannot be restored, but there is no concept of prison. So when I hear, for example, the right of criminals, we had rights of criminals. There was a way of restoring the criminal. So we can go on and on with these kind of things. So the concept underlying all that, it's the dignity of the person. And at some point, maybe the moderator will direct us toward that. I'll have something to say about why the faith took deep roots in our communities, because the Catholic faith came with a formulation of concepts, the human rights concept that we are already practicing without having them formulated into laws.
So I think that the discourse surrounding human rights in 1948 with the Declaration of Human Rights was very individually kind of focused. And I think in large part because America, Eleanor Roosevelt, and various other Western governments had been responsible for the language and were reiterating the value of the individual and the rights of the individual. And I do think, as my distinguished panelists have said here, that is somewhat contrary to the African spirit, because in Africa, there's a belief that the individual cannot flourish if the community cannot flourish. And so you can't assert individual rights at the expense of the community if that's going to cause the community to suffer in some way. And so I think it was both the idea in Africa that not only is the individual a person of infinite worth, but the community itself is a community of infinite worth, and that living together has value in kind of solidarity and subsidiarity as well. And so I think that when the discourse surrounding human rights first emerged, it was seen as contrary to African human rights because of the African focus on the community. But I think belatedly, the Western world has maybe come to the realization that if the community is not flourishing, if the rights of the community are not respected, then the individual can't flourish in those circumstances either.
That seems fairly clear, that maybe that assertion is false. But I need to press Dr. Eno and Professor Venter on this point about who constructed what. Partly because I want to go back to when the Africans had the chance to construct their own, and I'm thinking about African human rights instrument, they pretty much repeated a lot of what had been constructed by others. Now, how do you then kind of distinguish what they have constructed from what they were not? Could it be just a simple case of mirroring what the Westerners had constructed in 1948? Or is there a way in which what Professor Venter is pointing to, what Professor Kakinde is pointing to, what Father Paulinus is pointing to, something very uniquely, still uniquely African in the human rights that in a moment I'm going to ask you to explore the church is supposed to support. I mean, so what is the standard now?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Yeah, as has been explained, when the West constructed what I would call the modern human rights architecture, so many of the values that are specific to the African continent were not taken into account. If you look at the current African Charter on Human and People's Rights, you see that quite a number of things that are in the African Charter were not covered in the Universal Declaration, in the ICCPR, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant. For example, the idea even of naming the African Charter on Human and People's Rights tells you that Africans wanted to lay emphasis on the importance of peoples, the importance of community, the importance of solidarity. This is something which was never considered when the Universal Declaration was being constructed. And this is something which I think is part of the Catholic social teaching, the issue of solidarity. The other thing that was missing in the construction of the Universal Declaration is the idea of ensuring that economic, social, and cultural rights are as important as civil and political rights. If you look at the preamble of the African Charter, it emphasizes that there is no way you can enjoy civil and political rights without economic, social, and cultural rights. So a lot of emphasis has been placed on the right to development, ensuring that there's economic justice. Third, the issue of responsibility is something that is missing in most of the Western concept, that an individual in exercising your rights, you must also be wary, also be conscious of the fact that your rights may affect the enjoyment of the rights of others. The issue of duty is seriously ingrained in the African Charter. The duty of the individual towards the family. As a matter of fact, the African Charter provides that a child has a duty to ensure the care of the parents at later age. The duty towards the family, the duty towards the society, the duty towards the international community. So these are certain concepts, and all the three ideas I have raised mirror very well with some of the teachings, the Catholic social teachings, of a responsibility, of economic justice. So these are some of the things which pushed Africans to say, yes, while we agree with the universality of human rights, there are some specificities within the continent which we think should be included in our own African human rights system to take care of the specific issues affecting the African people.
Tona?
I would like to comment on that, but on two things. First, the construction of human rights is actually what is Western. And where it originated, who pushed for what. My students get shocked when I tell them that the independence of African countries can push forward earlier than planned, among other reasons, for the fact that there was already a Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and in 1960 people were still under colonization. The dramatic experience of the independence of India and the tragedy between India and Pakistan and all that, they had to do something. So that the kind of pressures that were behind the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, they determined how they were going to be crafted. Yeah. And that's why even in later instruments, international instruments, you don't see a trace of African cultures or idea of dignity or people's rights. I could pick just the Convention on the Rights of Children. you read it and like, which children are we talking about here? Yeah, in which context? Because you don't see anything about who children are in the African societies, what the dignity that we give to them. This is something a bit like a joke, but it's not a joke. I studied some years in Italy, and I like jogging, especially when the sceneries are like nice, like here. And then I'll see young mothers with their children, and I tussle the hair of the child or greeting the child, and then you see the mother shocked. So I make the point of stopping and tell them, in my culture, children must be greeted, and greeted warmly, because children must feel safe and welcomed everywhere. This is the future of our society. So I tell them, I don't have to do anything bad to your child. This is our culture. So the instruments never captured, but I think because there were, it's controversial to see that Professor Ado is going to kick me out of here, because those instruments became like an extension of a more elegant colonization, and that's why they didn't capture the structure of human rights in Africa.
Well, great.
About justice, I'll have the chance to say something about
Okay.
justice,
Right.
because he mentioned it, but later. No problem.
All right.
Thank you.
Quickly,
Quickly. So I think that Western human rights really focus very much on civil and political rights. So even though the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was promulgated at the same time as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the focus was on civil and political rights. And I think in the African kind of experience, those economic, social and cultural rights were equally as important. And I think now, again, human rights world is starting to recognize the importance of economic, social and cultural rights. And I'm thinking of the Freedom Charter in South Africa, which was drafted in 1955. And it said, but people have the right to the dignity of work, people have the right to the dignity of food. And those issues were equally as important as these individual human rights to vote.
Apollonius, I was coming to you, but I was going to pose a slightly different question. Now, because it's controversy, I don't want to press this controversy, I'm going to try and put something more in context. So now we understand the nature of human rights. Be it controversial, be it African, be it universal. You're one of 415,000 people with access to 281 million audiences, or people in your audience. Knowing the conversation with yourself, what exactly would you consider the role of the church? How should the church strike its contribution to, the word we use here is animating human rights, in terms of bringing human rights alive in Africa? With this kind of conversation, what exactly is the role of the church in animating human rights?
Working in the church in Africa and growing up in Africa and being around Africa for quite a while, I realized there are blind spots in the discourse or in the practice of human rights. You mentioned the Charter. The Charter says a lot about communal, cultural, whatever things, but it often tends to forget and think that it is Western, the individual. The emphasis on the individual must not be lost, even as we also emphasize the importance of the communal and so on. So when I look out there, the individual, let me give you some practical examples. In marriage cases, for example, when a young man meets a girl, or a girl meets a young man and they'll marry and so on, there are two kinds of rights clashing, the communal and the individual. Where I come from, it tends to be that in the end it is the communal that wins over. So the church is and has been trying to walk this fine line of making people responsive to the communal demands of their rights, but also to make sure that the individual is not lost. Somebody mentioned, and it can go to a lot of issues, the consciences of people. What am I free to do in right conscience as opposed to what the community is asking me to do, and so on. Those are areas that I think the church has been working hard to to walk a fine line on what the individual consciences, communal demands and needs, and how do you respect all of them, and how do you carry both? The tension exists, but the answer is not to deny that people have rights, or that the community also has rights. I've been working on an article for a long time, I've never finished, trying to respond to the South African philosophers, people like Metz and so on, who talk a lot about Ubuntu, who talk a lot about I am because we are, and so on. And reading carefully, I realized that Ubuntu can tend to become a cancel culture. If what the community does not want, then it does not happen. And if you dare, at least according to Metz and his group, if you dare to go against them, then you're out of the group. And I say, where is the balance? So this is one of the things that the church is striving, and as far as I know, to do in Africa, to make sure that there is a balance between the communal demands and the individual rights that people grow up or have, because they are God's creatures, they are individual persons, and they cannot be subsumed under the culture or under community interests.
Dr. Kindi, you mentioned that there were some very specific philosophical principles that underlie the church's teaching: dignity, solidarity. Now, in the effort to try and walk this very fine line between these controversies, what should guide the church? Should it be its set principles, or these be adjusted according to the environment? I mean, this kind of question that I should put to a priest. So feel free. Feel free to give it back to the priest.
I was going to ask you, didn't you ask him? No, but I would like to say that, what a pity, because we have a very short time. Those who have read, Pope John Paul II wrote a document called The Mission of the Redeemer, which is about the evangelization in the modern world. And I was very surprised to see how he captured correctly why he's trying to explain the concept of inculturation of the values of the church in different cultures. So what he explains is what actually you can see that has happened in Africa, and the values of the gospel find I would say a fertile ground in African cultures from the principles of natural law, because those principles are the ones that are so similar to the principles of African cultures. And I agree with him that I'm not very fond of the interpretation of Ubuntu by some South African authors, because I come from a cultural context in which Ubuntu means the fact of being human, but also I know there's a Rwandan student here, I think. In her language, the word Ubuntu also means generosity, the openness to share. Someone who has Ubuntu is someone who is generous. And those kind of principles underlie the concept of justice in our communities, which was mostly a distributive justice. Whether you speak about land or you speak possessions of any kind, it's a distributive. And then the interpretation of Ubuntu principles to implement a distributive justice system supposes that the person in charge of doing that is a wise person. So the principles of natural law that Catholic theologians have borrowed from the Romans, who had borrowed the rationality of it from the Greeks. Yeah? Those are the principles that you see that the church should be coherent with consistently. Because when she departs from that, then problems happen.
That is very helpful.
Yeah.
And on account of that, I'm going to problematize the conversation a little bit. I'm going to pick Professor Venter, and I know you have a particular interest in gender issues and this is a very difficult question in the context. In the light of the coherence that Professor Kakindi shows between African culture and the church's teaching, how should the church handle the gender controversy in Africa? And in any case, what is it?
So whoever picked the word animate, I'm going to borrow from that. So to me, that is spirit, right? The church's role should be prophetic, right? So I think that, and I'm thinking about South African history in particular, that during apartheid was adopted by the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the church of the National Party responsible for coming up with this theory of apartheid. And the Catholic Church and the Catholic Conference of Bishops called that out as basically a heresy, because the Dutch Reformed Church said, treating people of different races differently is biblically ordained, and the Catholic Church was the one to call that out as heretical. And so I think the church should resume that prophetic role, that you have to call people on their behavior when they're doing something wrong, that animus, that spirit. You've got to say, is this consistent with treating people as if they are of infinite worth? And I keep going back to that phrase, but that to me, is this practice consistent with that? That Father Paulinus was talking about marriage and the treatment of women in marriage, that it's very difficult for a woman to leave a marriage no matter what's happening to her within that marriage. And is that consistent with treating her like a person of infinite worth, right? And so I do think the church has a prophetic role to say, is there a way, and not to prescribe behavior, but is there a way that we can resolve this impasse? And calling people to account for their behavior.
Certainly addresses my anxieties, and thank you. I want to come to Dr. Ina, with all those years of experience in regional institutions, the courts, the commission. What exactly can the court do to enhance the work within the court and the commission? Should they be as litigants? Should they be kind of preaching the jurisprudence? I mean, what role can the court, in the light of now we know what drives the courts, the church's thinking, how could they represent this in the work that you do in the court and the commission?
The Catholic Church, yes. Yeah.
The church.
Yes. If we put the Catholic social teachings and the African human rights values side by side, we'll see that they are all the same. They are very similar. Take any of them, be it human dignity, economic justice, rights and responsibilities, you find them reflected in the African Charter. The question, therefore, is, with this similarity, why does the church still find it difficult to make a meaningful contribution in the African human rights space? I think, in my view, there has been some holding back from the Catholic Church. I don't know whether for political reasons, I don't know. We have instances where the Catholic Church has made pronouncements, have condemned issues, but I think more still needs to be done. There are a lot of issues African countries are facing as challenges in the implementation of their human rights obligations that they have undertaken. the statistics you gave regarding the influence of the Catholic Church, even though you raised it in the DRC, can be reflected in almost every African country. The Catholic Church is one of the largest growing constituency on the continent. Almost every African country has a bishop or a priest, and they have serious influence in each of these countries. It is very possible for a bishop to request to see the head of state of any country, an audience will be granted. But I have a sense that the bishops, the church authorities do not make appropriate use of that influence that they have. Because I think with the challenges that states are facing in human rights terms, if a bishop meets with a head of state and say, I hear you have not ratified this particular human rights instrument. I hear there was a decision of the African court which you have not implemented, and bring this directly to the head of state, I think something can be done. So in my view, there should be a more robust and proactive action from the Catholic Church.
I see that Father Paulinus would like to defend the church. And,
Not really, it's our church.
I'm going to hold it for a minute because I want to come back to you with a slightly different, because I'm actually wanting to leave these very loose ends for the reception. And I'm kind of encouraging these kind of unanswered bits so that when we have the reception, the audience can actually tackle you. So rather than me pressing this and getting you into a debate, I want to avoid that. But what I do want is the idea that the title says, how does the Catholic Church, or Catholic teaching, animate? Not how can it? So I want us to move away from what the speculation is. I want you all to reflect on what has the church done. There's one thing to have a coherence of ideas, one thing to have options, one thing to not push the options. Question is, what has it done on the ground? Where is the evidence of the church? So I want to give that to Father Paulinus. Just sell the church as best as you can, as far as human rights is concerned.
That is a tall order. Two things, negatively and positively. The negative thing is, Professor No was talking about the African Charter. I have been in contexts where the bishops of Africa spoke out against the Maputo Protocol and said, this is not right. So, yeah, line by line,
But can you just explain, for those who are not so sure what the Maputo Protocol covers, you may want to explain that.
Well, you are lawyers. This is the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
The protocol on the rights of women.
Oh,
Yeah,
the rights
it
of women.
focuses on the rights of women and guarantees the right to abortion.
For
One of the
abortion. And
articles
so this
specifically
was the one
guarantees the right to
area.
abortion.
This was the one area where the bishops, in fact, even at the synod you referenced here in 2009, were very worried about. When you place line by line the Charter of Human Rights, the church agrees in most of them. But this particular area has been a bone of contention. That's number one. Number two, what has the church been doing? Referencing Nigeria, I remember very clearly the military era in Nigeria. I mean, the only institution left standing, actually, was the church. They were fighting the military, addressing them. In fact, they came to a point where I was in context where the bishops were told, be ready that one day some of you will be found on the street dead. That was how bad the things were. So until people said, people now forget it, without the Catholic Church and without Nadeco, there would have been no return to civil rule in Nigeria, in that kind of thing. And let me also tell you one practical thing. My sister used to work for Radio Nigeria, my late sister. Obasanjo, great Obasanjo as he was nursing the idea of coming back to power for the third time. So Radio Nigeria had a Christmas get-together where the Archbishop of Abuja with the president sitting in front of him. He said, yeah, Your Excellency, I hear there are rumors around here that you want to come back to power. Please don't listen to those rumors. This is not
Very
a banana
diplomatic.
republic. Go, the records are there. My sister told me that after that incident, the Director General of Radio Nigeria called them together and said, who invited this bishop here? And said, next time, don't bring him in. But from then on, the government began to defend itself and all that. But simple things like that. Bishops all over Africa, you're talking about DRC. The role that the bishops of the DRC have played in stemming the tide of chaos in that country is not spoken.
And it's beautiful. Now that I mentioned DRC, you have the floor.
Yeah.
DRC as such, but the reason why Dr. Eno thinks that the church shouldn't hold back and should occupy more the space, the human rights space. But one thing, the church, the idea of separation between church and state came from Catholic philosophers. And the church does respect that because her mission is a spiritual mission, right? And it, in virtue of that spiritual mission, that she defends human rights whenever she can, right? So you can see one of the greatest things that the church has done to animate the discourse of human rights. It sounds far-fetched. It's her monumental work in education. Monumental work in education and in health, right? And in the defense of the family. But you see why the church could find a beautiful echo defending the family. Because the greatest value the African society has is the family. Even when you think of the gender controversy, don't worry, I will not go to the controversies. Yeah? So it's like the defense of the monogamous marriage in the Catholic Church. It was such an incredible defense of the right of women, because in the polygamous structure, who are the first casualties of that structure? So we can go on and on. So I think that maybe we can go back to the concept of education, because that's where she has done a lot to promote the awareness of human dignity, the sense of equality, and everything that comes. So I didn't want to let this chance go without bringing that to
That was a very good example. Now, Professor Venter.
Well, one of the things that the church could be doing, so
Well,
obviously
we're looking for what they have done.
what they have done, okay. So what they have done, I think they've called to mind, well, a number of things. They've called to mind inequalities, right? And they have said that the way that we treat people, the way that we treat the least members of our society is reflective on us all as a society. And I think that's a really important contribution. Definitely education. We were talking the other day that many African leaders have been educated by the Catholic Church, by mission schools. And the other thing that I think that they have done is also offer people a place of refuge. So during the apartheid struggle, one of the biggest churches in South Africa is a 2,000-seat church, Catholic church called Regina Mundi. And if anyone was being pursued by the authorities, they would be offered sanctuary by the church. And it was such a famous church that Nelson Mandela has designated a day called Regina Mundi Day, which celebrates that particular church and for the work that it did during the apartheid struggle. So that, I think, is one of the things that has happened. And I think that's really significant, because I do want to point out South Africa is not a Catholic country. Only 6% of the population are Catholics in South Africa. But the church has had an outsized influence compared to the size of its people.
Well, just so to be fair, I'm going to go back to Dr. Eno on this question of give me an area where the church, in your opinion, has actually stood up.
Yeah, I think I'll refer to Cameroon. in Cameroon, apart from the government, or after the government, the Catholic Church in particular is the next institution that has the highest number of schools, the highest number of hospitals in far remote areas that maybe even the government is unable to reach. So in terms of education, in terms of schools, and in terms of trying to empower people, I think in some provinces, the Catholic Church has been building vocational centers, encouraging microfinancing and things like that. So in terms of ensuring the empowerment of the people, the Catholic Church has done extremely well. I'm looking at other aspects where the Catholic Church can even do more. When I was in Zambia, I worked with a Catholic outfit called the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace. I don't know whether it is in every country. And they were able to, amongst other things, provide free legal services, paralegal services to people whose rights were being violated. They were able to take government to task for certain human rights issues. They're providing free legal services to people. These are some of the things I would like to see a proactiveness of the church, because you come to some of these African human rights institutions, people do not access them because they don't have the resources to do so, not because their rights have not been violated. And these are people who I'm sure if the Catholic Church were to look at them, how can we help you and things like that, I think they can be able to access some of these human rights facilities.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, the church is hereby exonerated from all its sins. I know that our time is pressing, and I really want to make room for question and answers. And the Dean very kindly gave us an extra 5 minutes. Thank you, Dean Cole. So we could press on. Can I just ask one very final question? And this is really to ask you to look into the future. And I know from the beginning, Dr. Eno, you're talking about what the church can do. What's the future going to look like between the church and human rights on the continent? I mean, where in the next 10 years do you think the emphasis is going to be? Consult the oracle, do whatever you can, come up with something. Where is it, if I came back to you in 10 years' time, where would you pitch your ball?
The youth. The youth, the Africa's youth is in trouble. And a lot of them go to school when there are schools to go to. And a lot of them graduate, no work, no direction. And a lot of them are being taken up or taken over by all the negative things that go on in the internet. Africa's future is in danger from that point of view. And I wish I knew how to, and I hope we find how to see what we can do to make sure that this generation is not lost. That Africa does something, the youth.
That's certainly. Dr. Eno.
Yes, I couldn't hesitate to support the father. The statistics you gave when we started points to the fact that by 2050, about 1/3 of Africa will be Catholic. And more than half of that are people below 35 years. So I think that is where, in my view, the Catholic Church should focus, because there are so many ills affecting people in that category. Unemployment, drug abuse, so many things. And with the kind of preaching that we are having nowadays, it may, as the father has said, it may lead to a lost generation if something is not done. The second thing I want to say is that I think the Catholic Church should take advantage of the commonality between the Catholic social teaching and the African values to see how to penetrate the African human rights system and make more influence. I think in one of the discussions we had, I had said that I don't see the Catholic Church enough in African human rights institutions. I'm not sure about the Catholic structure, but it would be beneficial for the Catholic Church to extend its tentacles if the Catholic Church were represented during African Union meetings, the heads of state assembly, the executive council, where the bishops can meet directly with heads of state, talk to them directly. So if the Catholic Church, I don't know that there's an umbrella structure of the Catholic Church representing Africa, they can have observer status before the African Union. So that they do, okay. So at each African Union summit, all observers are invited. And that is where you meet all the heads of state, all the policymakers on the continent. And you can easily have access to these policymakers and put across your issues. It may be difficult to meet with heads of state at their headquarters, at the capitals, but it may be very easy to meet them when in these informal settings. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Professor Venter, let me come to you first, and then I'll go to Professor Kakindi on this question of where the church is going to be in the next
50. So that is a difficult question. I think that we need strong leaders in the church to stand up and do the things that Dr. Eno and Father Paulina suggested. But I also think the Catholic Church needs to focus on inequality because that is one of the biggest things confronting Africa. So I think in the post-colonial period, people thought, well, things will change, right? And they haven't. And the people who are in power haven't worked for the least members of society. And I think the Catholic Church needs to use its influence to call out that inequality. And if it doesn't, it's going to lose much of that influence. It's going to be seen as irrelevant by young people whose lives are not looking promising at this time.
And finally?
Things. First, that the Catholic Church is already very active in everything to do with the youth. Because it has schools, kindergarten, primary schools, high schools, universities, vocational centers of a huge, the congregation like the one of St. John Bosco, they have thousands and thousands of people trained vocationally to, well, you don't hear so many people who want to study carpentry or plumbing, or that they're still doing that, and you find that young people coming from those centers are the ones who are getting employment, even more than the ones who are coming out of universities. So the Catholic Church is already working with the youth. The Catholic Church has become like the lone voice in the fight against corruption. That's why the presidents don't like to give them the bishops' audiences because they call them out on corruption and on many other, like the activities or some very powerful resources from outside are pushing agendas of all kinds of things. The Catholic Church still is a great defender of its own principle, the one that's called the option for the poor, because she's taking care of the poor more than any other institution. Every conference of Catholic bishops has a commission of justice and peace. And I would encourage, if there is any Catholic student here, that you have a wealth of information if you go to study what those commissions do, yeah? To see how, what are the human rights issues, because those ones are dealing with them. And all Catholic, Conference of Catholic Bishops have that commission that is one of the busiest of the commissions they have. So that's one thing. The other thing is that for the future, I'll come back to what I said before. The identity of the church and its original mission, the coherence of it is what is going to get the church to continue her mission and reach further. Because if the church becomes just another activist, right, then we have a problem. Because her mission is teaching and charity, right? Following the specific principles of actions that the social doctrine, the book is this big, I think some of you have seen it, that outlined them. So just like the consistency, coherence, and facing the new challenges at every stage using the same principle is what the church, because she's been here for 2,000 years, right? She's not going to disappear in 50 years. She can do more. And look at this institution here. I mean, I don't know what kind of link exists between institutions like this one and what the bishops are doing in the state. I don't know. But that is like the side that had to be more proactive, I think, is the side of the faithful, because the bishops do their job as Catholics or Catholic institutions. We have to be like the longer manus of the church to get to higher goals. Thank you.
Looks like we're all headed for heaven. All right. Okay, now we pretty much reached the point of the panel's contribution. I suspect some of you are itching to ask questions. Now, because the event is being recorded, we want to encourage you to go to one of the two microphones to pose your question so that it can be captured in the recording. All right, any questions? Inko.
Yes, I think the panelists have spoken eloquently about the way in which the Catholic Church has interacted with government officials to try to put pressure on them to respect human rights. But what we're witnessing today across much of Africa are violations of human rights by non-governmental actors and entities, right? We've got the Catholic Church providing education and schooling in parts of northern Nigeria, and then those places are being raided by Boko Haram, and young girls are being taken prisoner. We've got oil companies and others violating human rights across Africa. What kind of influence can the church have with respect to protecting human rights when the violators of human rights are not governmental actors?
Right. Who wants to take that? All right.
Thanks, Dean Cole. This is where I think the role of the church in trying to help state institutions is important. In other words, it's important that the church cannot be police. The church does not have the army. The church. So this is where the church must do everything it can to speak to people in power, to make sure that the institutions that provide security and protect people's lives are in order. The situation you have, like you're referencing Nigeria, so let me mention that, and not just Nigeria, but around the Sahel, that area, is a situation where there are people who have now become bandits all over the place and have taken over kind of the society and so on. So what does the church do? The church is in itself a victim of this. In many priests have lost their lives. Many nuns have. Many people, not just the Catholic Church, even Muslims. So how can the church help the state to strengthen itself? First of all, one, I think by insisting that elections be fair. By insisting that elections be fair, and if people are not playing by that rule, calling them out. And by insisting that people, therefore, have a right to choose who takes. And then when people get into power, our politicians have become daft, have become very, very close to any kind of reasoning. It's a big problem, but if the state does not get its act together, then there's not else we can do about this.
Can I add to that as well, that I think a lot of the pillaging of Africa is being done by businesses as well. So many African countries are rich in natural resources and minerals, and there are businesses and huge conglomerates that are taking advantage of that and not thinking about the welfare of the workers who go down the mines, or what's happening environmentally to the country when they, extract whatever they're trying to extract. And so I think, not to plug your class, but business and human rights, that infusing an ethics of, the notion of stewardship. If you're going to engage in this kind of business, you have to be good stewards, and you have to be responsible for the workers and what happens to them and the conditions that they have to operate in.
You have to forgive me, but because of the question, I thought I should, I'm not a panelist, but I thought I'll reflect on a few things. I just felt the question just had an arrow to my head, and I should. All churches have to ask who their parishioners are. And if you just take a closer look, every CEO goes to some church. And in Africa, most of these people are Catholics. And I think rather than, in addition to targeting governments, you need to target your own parishioners and get. The other problem you have with private actors is they operate on an even playing field. The capacity of the victims against the capacity of those who are causing the harm is not the same. The church can level that field by creating a lot of capacity building, either through empowering them in education, empowering them with sanctuaries. So that capacity building can also help in terms of getting there. But even finally, what the church does best, bringing people together. I think if it is really going to go beyond governments, it has to try and bring communities together. I know that, as Father Paulinus is saying, the church itself is a victim. Being a victim doesn't mean you lose your ability to do what you do best, bringing people together to talk, to understand each other. And I think that may be some ways in which the church can actually address non-state actors.
Just to add to what you've said, Prof, the UN has adopted social corporate responsibility principles, the guiding principles on corporate social responsibility. These are principles which I think, as you've indicated, if the church were to insist on every CEO, every entrepreneur that apply these principles, whether you are a state or you are a non-state actor, I think it will help to deal with some of these atrocities. But on the specific issue raised by the Dean, it is very difficult to see what the church can do in a situation like Boko Haram, where even the international community is finding it difficult to manage them. Even the state is finding it difficult to manage them. Unfortunately, international law is still grappling to hold non-state actors responsible. What is being done now is to indict them before the ICC, and they are charged before the ICC. That is a completely separate branch of international law. But in human rights terms, atrocities committed within a country under the jurisdiction of a particular country, that government is held responsible. I'll give you an example. When I was with the African Commission, Shell Petroleum had serious problems in eastern Nigeria. The whole area was polluted due to oil extraction. The government said that no, it is not them. They didn't have any responsibility. But the African Commission held the Nigerian government responsible because Shell was operating under its jurisdiction. And it had the possibility to check the excesses of Shell petroleum. Yeah, so some of these things are a bit tricky, especially when dealing with non-state actors. The African Commission has a working group, I'm sure this will be of interest to you, Prof, a working group on business and human rights, which have laid down key principles to be followed by anyone operating business. The African Commission has a working group on extractive industries. Yeah, so these are things that I think the Catholic Church can disseminate throughout its constituency for its members to know about these principles and be able to engage with those responsible.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question. Any
There's
questions?
somebody who's been wanting to.
Yeah, please, please queue up if you want to. Don't wait until you're called. Just, fire away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm something that's always been interesting to me is the buildings of the Catholic churches and how ornate and sort of beautiful they are. And for me, for some people, that might bring up the fact that they look nice, but what it often brings out for me is the idea of this extended wealth that the church has. And that leads me to thinking about its complicity in human rights violations too, through its hoarding of wealth, given that the highest person, the guy at the Vatican, I forget his name, and given that the Vatican itself is in the middle of Rome, I guess, Italy, and how big and ornate the services are, how much money has been spent. And for sort of like this conversation on human rights, we often talk about like a lot of spaces where even these entities that are upholding human rights also participate in the capitalist system. And so it makes me think, how is the Catholic Church holding itself responsible for human rights violations that it is committing just by participating in the capitalist system, or even further than that, if that makes sense?
It makes sense.
Yeah. Everyone looks at Father Paulinus.
Me? Why me? I don't know the answer to this, what you're saying, but I think as you were saying this, I was trying to remember the churches I've been part of building, or even in my village. These are contributions by people who would give in according to their means. Like my parish church at home, in my part of Orthodiocese, is quite ornate. But there was never anybody forced to give anything. People were encouraged to make donations. And then in the end, it is the community's property. It is a place of worship that they go to. But it is not too extravagantly furnished, but they try to build something that will last for a long time. And in my place, that church has taken over 15 to 20 years to build, but it is now in place. And people, their dime, whatever their pennies are contributing. Nobody in the Catholic Church is going to force you. That's also the Catholic Church is one of the churches that asks people to pay tithes. No. If any priest does that, then he is in violation, actually. You are not asking people, you are asking people to make contributions just in freedom to erect a
As I understand the question clearly, I mean, it's more about, more specifically, how the Catholic Church invests its money, for example. Where does it invest its money, and how much of it makes it complicit in human rights violations? I mean, we may not know this, but that's the question that I assume.
But there is always a constant search, even in like the religious community I belong to, the Holy Ghost Fathers, Puritans, for example, they're always asking, even in chapters, where are our funds going? Who are we enabling? And so, and in fact, where was I? And at a point, even in my community in this country, were asking, in regard to fossil fuels, all those kinds of things, are investments being tracked properly? And so there is always that soul searching to make sure that you invest wisely. And
Can I say something? First, to the question of terrorism, the church has no means to fight terrorism because it's too big. And then also the church cannot claim to become a fourth arm of government to hold governments to account. I just wanted to mention that because there's a big temptation to think that we should be. Now, as for the buildings, the buildings of the Catholic Church are places of worship that are structured according to the presence of the Lord who is there and the dignified worship of the Lord who is there. So they're not built using funds that are in violation of anybody's right. So it's always an accusation that should maybe put in a different way. Yeah. So in Nairobi, I know that the conference of the Catholic bishop in Nairobi has something that's called a cooperative system of savings, but it is to support schools, hospitals, but also to offer stable interest to the ones who save with them so that they're not at the mercy of what is happening incited from the central bank or things like that. So, and that is another different fight for the economic freedom of people, and it's real. So sometimes I tell my students, like, okay, before we throw stones at the Catholic Church building sanctuaries of worship, we can, you have a wonderful sanctuary, the religion of sport. No, in this university it's not the religion of sport because you already have a religion, but sports stadiums have become like
the new cathedrals.
The new cathedrals of new kind of religions. So if you compare that to what the Catholic Church does with a few brick that every parishioner brings, because this is how we raise funds. From one brick, who can afford a brick, who can afford 10 bricks, and who can afford a bag of cement. And that's how they are built. Yeah? And it's a victory of the Catholic Church in the sub-Saharan African countries to have reached the point of building churches like that. It's not money from some Europeans that's happening. It's like something we wear like a badge. Where does it meet our culture? In my community, we are cattle rearing people, and we are in places of horrible thunderstorms. So that when you lose your cattle because they've been hit by thunder, it is a custom that everyone else who has more than one cow has to give you a cow, right? So the person who lost 3 cows end up having 23, more than anyone else who gave him, and nobody complains about that because it is like that. So that's the Ubuntu. So I don't agree with the accusation that the Catholic Church, maybe in some wealthy countries, the church is engaging in unethical investment, or I don't know, but not in sub-Saharan Africa. No.
I'm very conscious of the time and people needing to be in places, including me. And since I have the microphone, I will offer room for one very quick question. Yes, quick. Microphone.
Hello? I don't know if it'll be a quick question, but
Well, make it quick.
there's an argument that sometimes the Catholic Church has worked against human rights and development in Africa. I'm mostly thinking Southern Africa on the issue of HIV/AIDS, the Church's opposition to artificial contraception. effective, recognized way of preventing the spread of diseases like that. In that case, is the church in the wrong? Should they repudiate? How do they handle a situation like that?
Let me ask you a
The
question.
official,
You have just heard that South Africa is just 6% Catholic. And South Africa allows the use of so how can, the Catholic Church was never voiced enough to stop South Africans from using contraceptive in that regard. It was never a voice. It was not, and yet, South Africa, sorry to say, had one of the greatest or worst situations of the HIV spread and so on. Was it the Catholic Church that caused it? No. No. The thing is, this thing ran against a lot of more difficult questions around contraception and so on in the Catholic Church, and we don't have time to talk about it here now. But the fact is that since the 60s, or for example, there have been debate about about contraception, what to allow, what is not, what is right, and this debate is not just a human rights issue. It is more a theological question. You know, what have we the mandate to do with regard to reproductive issues and so on? And this is also the thing that runs into the Maputo Protocol and so on. So let me shut up and let others talk.
Right, that was a quick one, and I'm sure that kind of sets our mind thinking about a lot of these questions. And as I suggested much earlier, the conversation has been rich and it's actually prompted a lot of thinking, which I hope will continue during the reception. But since some of us have to be somewhere else, first of all, I want to thank Phil for arranging for this to happen. Josh, Gillian, and Thomas, you're still in the Human Rights Program. We want to thank you for bringing such a wonderful panel together. And to the panelists, all I can say, you have been amazing. And you have enlightened us, and you have kind of taught us a lot about the Catholic Church and human rights. So I want, please, ladies and gentlemen, us to put our hands together and say thank you.